Hello, friend. Welcome to having an evergreen relationship with God, where we study a portion of God's Word so we can keep our relationship with Him evergreen, vibrant, and full of life in every season. Today, we're looking at Women of God Journal, which is what we're doing during our journaling week at this moment. And we're looking at day 2, which talks about Abigail. So this is 1 Samuel 25. And to put it in context, this is the end of the book of 1 Samuel, towards the end. And David has technically been anointed, but he is not king. He's still running from Saul, and a lot of different things happen while he's waiting to be king. And that's a whole nother story. But here in this story, we're looking at a certain woman of God, and this is Abigail. And this is how the chapter opens up for us, the story. So David is going into the wilderness, and there was a man there who was very rich, and his name was Nabal, and his wife's name is Abigail. And it says in verse 3, the woman was discerning and beautiful, but the man was harsh and badly behaved. So already from the start, that's what we know about Abigail, was that she was discerning and beautiful. That was the first thing. And it's not the opposite. She wasn't beautiful first and then discerning. The most important part is that she could know how to tell things apart. She was discerning. And that takes training, which we'll talk about later. So David heard in the wilderness that Nabal was shearing his sheep, says in verse 4. And so he goes to Nabal and says, through his servants, greet them in my name, and says, you shall greet him and say, peace to you, peace to your house, and peace be to all you have. Now your shepherds have been with us, and we did them no harm, and they missed nothing in all the time they were with us. Ask your young men, and they will tell you. And then he goes on to say that they came on a feast day, and says, please give whatever you have at hand to your servants and to your son David. So this is a request from David. He's been in the wilderness, and it says he's been with the servants of Nabal, and they've been out doing different things, but David and his men protected those who belonged to Nabal and doing all of those things. And so now he comes, and it's a feast day. So he is kindly requesting that the favor be returned, that they can have rest and food in the midst of their journey, of what they've been doing. So then in verse 9, David's young men go and they tell him everything, and Nabal's answer shouldn't surprise us too much based off of all we know about him, was that it's that he is harsh and badly behaved. So he says, who is David? Who is the son of Jesse? There are many servants these days who are breaking away from their masters. Shall I take my bread and my water and my meat that I have killed from my shearers and give it to men who come from I do not know where? And that was his answer. That's all the Bible tells us about what Nabal had said. That was the answer to what David had come to tell peacefully. So it wasn't anything too grand. It was fighting words very much against what was being requested. And he didn't show any hospitality. He offered nothing to them. And he didn't give, so that would be the most to expect. Next would be at least some gratitude. He says, we did them no harm. Your shepherds were with us. They missed nothing when they were with us. So Nabal didn't even give any sort of thanks or gratitude. And then at the very least, if Nabal didn't think that that was true, he could have investigated a little bit and asked and see what would have happened. Just basic, I guess you could say common sense things that would not be part of what a fool would say. But as we know, more specifically, it calls Nabal a fool later in this chapter. Just didn't quite answer the way that he should have. And there are several times that we see that happen. So when David's young men returned, David said, every man strap on his sword, and they were going up against Nabal. So that's the setup. That is the setup before we get to see Abigail and before we get to know what her part in the story is this contention that has taken place. And that's where we come to her in verse 14. But one of the young men told Abigail, Nabal's wife, "Behold, David sent messengers to greet our master, and he railed at them." And then in verse 15, it is interesting because this is what David said in verse 8. He said, "Ask your young men, and they will tell you." And this is one of the young men in verse 15. "Yet the men were very good to us, and we suffered no harm, and we did not miss anything while we were in the fields as long as we went with them. They were a wall to us, both night and day, all the while we were with them, keeping the sheep." So being able to see that part of the story and hearing that, yes, that is true. David's not just saying that. It is true that the servants of Nabal, whenever they were in the fields and they were doing the master's work, the work that they were supposed to do, they were very generously protected by David and by his men wherever they went, even as so far as to saying they were a wall about them, day and night. And very much so, not missing anything, no harm, very good to us, all very high praise, and something very much worth of gratitude to say that is well done and that is something appreciated. So then he says to Abigail, "Now therefore know this and consider it what you should do." In other words, it says, other ways of saying it is, be aware of this, think it over, just know that this is happening. "For harm is determined against our master and against all his house, and he is such a worthless man that one cannot speak to him." Which is a pretty accurate description of a fool, someone who cannot be reasoned with, someone that cannot speak to him. It won't make a difference. This is what Abigail is handed. She is handed this situation that is so out of her hands, seemingly. And who knows if this is the first time this situation has come to pass or if this is something that has happened more than once. But this insult has happened on behalf of her household, so to speak, and she has to make a decision. And that's when it goes back to verse 3. And when we are told that she's discerning, we get to see in action how she's discerning. And one of those things is the very first part of verse 18. It says, "Then Abigail made haste," making a decision in that quick of time, part of the discerning. Sometimes it takes time to make a decision, but she knew what to do because of certain things that she had already prepared for and put in place. So as we keep going, she prepared 200 loaves, 2 skins of wine, 5 sheep, grain, raisins, 200 cakes of figs, all these things. And she told the young men, "Go on before me, I come after you." She did not tell her husband, Nabal. And she rode and she came to David and his men, and she met them. Now David has said, "Surely in vain I guarded all that this fellow has in the wilderness, so that nothing was missed of all that belonged to him, and he has returned me evil for good." That is where David was standing. He had worked and had done things that were not of his. It wasn't supposed to be his to do, taking care of everything of this fellow, and knowing that he was being returned evil for good. And there are a lot of times that happens in life, and it seems very much unfair. And this is where David is standing from his perspective. And we're not even sure how long these men were with him in the wilderness, how long they've been protecting them on top of what they needed to protect themselves, as they're still wandering, likely still fleeing from Saul, just in that phase where he's not king. He's king, but he's not king. And that still doing something good for other people in this phase. That's where David is. Then verse 23, when Abigail saw David, she hurried and got down from the donkey and fell before David on her face and bowed to the ground. And she fell at his feet and said, "On me alone, my Lord, be the guilt." That is such a crazy opening line that she would say, "It's my fault." That sounds so backwards to anything that we think should be said, especially nowadays. that wasn't anything of her doing. Why should she apologize? And even for her to say the guilt, that should be on her. That doesn't sound fair in the least bit. But she keeps going. She says, "Please hear, let not my lord regard this worthless fellow, for as his name is, Nabal, his folly is with him. But I, your servant, did not see the young men of my lord whom you sent." And she says several things in this next section that shows where she's coming from, what she knows, and how she looks at life. And it shows that she knows God. So verse 26, "Now then, my lord, as the Lord lives, and as your soul lives, because the Lord has restrained you from blood guilt and from saving with your own hand, now then let your enemies and those who seek to do evil to my lord be as Nabal. And now let this present that your servant has brought to my lord be given to the young men who follow my lord. Please forgive the trespass of your servant." So David was strapping on his sword, ready to take out everyone in Nabal's household. And it said in verse 22, not even leaving one male among them. And this is what Abigail's presented with. And she said, "Please, may the Lord restrain you from blood guilt." And then the rest of verse 28, it says, "For the Lord will certainly make my Lord a sure house." So God will certainly make my Lord David a sure house, because my Lord is fighting the battles of the Lord. So she recognized that David is fighting the battles of God. Whatever he's been doing beforehand, she's heard of it. She knows that this is something that is done in God, that he is fighting God's battles, that he's on the right side. He's on the side that is for what is good and right and true. And she continues in verse 29 and says, "The life of my Lord shall be bound in the bundle of the living in the care of the Lord your God." Just the blessing of saying that his life is bound in the bundle of the living in the care of God, that God is with him, that God is taking care of him, that David's life is precious, and that it is bound and it is secured and it is taken care of. And she honors that. And she doesn't want anything to go against that for David. And then verse 30, "When the Lord has done to my Lord according to all the good he has spoken concerning you, and has appointed you prince over Israel, my Lord shall have no cause of grief or pangs of conscience for having shed blood without cause, or for my Lord working salvation for himself." So in a nutshell, she says, whenever all this good is coming that God said would happen, whenever you are appointed prince over Israel, which remember that hasn't officially happened yet, but it is known. And she says that she doesn't want him to have any cause of grief or pangs of conscience for what he had done to Nabal and to everything here. No guilt, no bloodshed, nothing that would be against him, and saving him from that. And then the very last thing she says, "And when the Lord has dealt well with my Lord, then remember your servant." So a humble request at the end. But everything before that is for David's good and showing honor to him. So this is David's response. After Abigail says all of that, the first thing he says, verse 32, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of Israel, who sent you this day to meet me. Blessed be your discretion, and blessed be you, who have kept me this day from blood guilt and from working salvation with my own hand." He recognizes that this could have been a very different ending to the story. And he blesses God. He praises God for Abigail, thanks God for her, and for her discretion, for her judgment, her discerning that she had, knowing to come and to tell this to David and to keep him from the blood guilt. As it goes on in verse 34, For as surely as the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, who has restrained me from hurting you, unless you had hurried and come to meet me, truly by morning there had not been left to Nabal so much as one male. So he recognizes that it would have been very different if she had not had that discernment to know what to say, but also that she had hurried to come to him and she knew what to say in the moment. And so he received from her hand what she had brought him and said, "Go in peace. I have obeyed your voice. I have granted your petition." So the peace that she has, knowing that what was initially offered at the very beginning, when David came and said peace to Nabal, to his household and everything that Nabal rejected, he is now offering it back to Abigail and says, "Go in peace to your house. Your petition is granted, and crisis has been averted." So Abigail does. And when she came to Nabal, he was holding a feast in his house, like the feast of a king, and Nabal's heart was very merry within him, for he was very drunk. And that, in the context of everything, tells us a lot more about Nabal, because it shows that even with what he said to David and saying that he couldn't take care of him, that he wouldn't. And then we see him in the next part, holding a feast for himself, like the feast of a king. And just knowing the contrast that David has been anointed king, that he has and will have the rights of a king, but it was denied the simplest of hospitality in return for good that he had done to Nabal and to his servants. And this is where we find Nabal. And it also helps knowing that David was still taken care of. All the things that Abigail had prepared for him, it's like she brought it to him in the of the feast day. All these things that has been brought to him. And so this is David and his men are being taken care of, and they are restrained from blood guilt. And Abigail goes home, and this is what she comes with after her discernment. And she continued to be discerning because she told him nothing, as he was very drunk, but she waited. In verse 37, in the morning, when the wine had gone out of Nabal, his wife told him these things, and his heart died within him, and he became a stone. And about 10 days later, the Lord struck Nabal, and he died. Which, in some respect, gives us a sense of justice. In another respect, all the details are it's real life. It's not just a story. And knowing that his heart died within him, the heart that was merry within him, just a couple of verses away beforehand, his heart became a stone. And then it was 10 days before he was struck and died. And I wonder what Abigail was thinking in those days and where her heart was as far as her prayers to God and what those 10 days looked like for her in the middle of Nabal and knowing that she had averted the crisis. But what did that mean for her life? What was her life going to look like? And then after Nabal's death, knowing that she no longer had the male protector, so to speak, if we could call him that. So then it goes to verse 39. When David heard that he was dead, he said, "Blessed be the Lord who has avenged the insult that I received, that kept back his servant from wrongdoing. The Lord has returned the evil of Nabal on his own head." Then David sent and spoke to Abigail to take her as his wife. So in the end, God takes care of Abigail. It says, the servant of David came to Abigail and told her, "David has sent you to take you to him as his wife." And she rose, bowed with her face on the ground, and said, "Behold, your handmaid is a servant to wash the feet of the servants of my Lord." Another very humble and discerning and very beautiful, the truly beautiful kind of response, and saying she is a servant, not just to be a servant, not just to wash the feet of my Lord, whom she addresses as David adds, but she says to wash the feet of the servants of my Lord. So coming in with much humility, but she went and followed and became his wife, to be taken care of, to have a protector. And God took care of that. God gave her peace in the discernment, and also a way to have peace that would last. So we don't know all the in between that happened with her being Nabal's wife and all the things that we know about him. If we listed it all, he was harsh and badly behaved. Verse 3, railed at David's young men and servants. Verse 14, was called a worthless man to whom no one can speak to. Verse 18, worthless fellow like his name, folly is with him. Verse 25, and returned evil for good, it said in verse 21. All those different things, which are very, it's not a good character description, and thinking about all the in-between moments. That is what she was dealing with for an unknown amount of time. And then to have this situation and know that it seemed very unfair, just as unfair as David felt being treated by Nabal, Abigail having that unfair situation being laid at her feet. It just overwhelms our sense of justice, and we don't like it. we see that, and several times we find ourselves in situations that are not of our own choosing or of our own doing, and we want justice for ourselves because we feel like we get walked over sometimes and that we get taken advantage of, and there's a straw that breaks the back. And there are definitely boundaries that we have to set, and fighting for what is right and good and true. But sometimes there are unfair situations that we are given, and it depends how we're going to react to them. How are we going to deal with them? Are we going to deal with them as the world does, or as God would have us to? Because we know that as far as unfair situations go, we are the culprit. We are like Nabal. We are the one that lays down a very unfair situation in front of the feet of God because we sinned against him. We were the fools. We were the ones with folly. And God was given a situation that either he was separated from us forever, or he had to make a very hard decision that was completely unfair to him, and that he would have to come and die if we could ever be with him. So in those moments, in those unfair situations, as hard as it is, looking at Christ and knowing that he came to clean up our mess and pay the price for it, it changes our perspective. And it helps us to be more discerning in those situations and know, how would God want me to react to this? Yes, I need boundaries. And yes, I need to be a humble servant of God. Those two can exist. And knowing that we act like Christ and we show Christ, because that is our whole purpose on earth, is to be closer to him and bring as many to be close to him so we can be with him forever, reunited with him. It's a beautiful story about discernment, but also the relationship that Abigail had with God, and knowing how to handle it, and also honoring David's relationship with God, calling him the king to be, knowing that he was fighting the battles of God, that his life was bound in the care of God, that it says in verse 28 through 30, that she says she honored and recognized that. And that's a big thing. And then she helped keep him from blood guilt and avenging, working out the salvation with his own hands, restraining him from hurting her household and everything that she had. Verse 33 and 34. And as he says, the Lord has avenged and kept his servant from wrongdoing, from returning evil. And that's a huge thing for her to do that, and not only honor him in that way, but honor him in keeping him from doing things that God would not approve of, or that would go against how God would want David to act. So not only for herself, but for others, which is huge. So discerning is the first thing we know about her. that she was intelligent, of good understanding, good sense. Some other versions or other words that are used with that are skill or success. And that's something that she would have trained for. Verse 17, the servant comes to her and says, "Consider what you should do. Know and be aware, think it over, see what you can do." Which makes us wonder if this wasn't the first time this happened. But then verse 25, and she said, "I did not see the young men you sent." But verse 32, when David said, "Blessed be your discretion." And she made haste. She knew what to do. And for us, there may be situations that come up quite fast. And there are some that do need to have time taken to figure out what to do. But there's some that if we are trained, as it says in Hebrews 5, that we know what to do because we are training to know between good and evil. We know what the good and the bad is. We know what God would want us to do because we spend time in His Word. We spend time learning from Him. Hebrews 5:14, that we are trained by constant practice to distinguish good from evil, to know what it means to fight God's battles and fight for good and not for evil. To know that He's the one that sees everything, that sees all the injustice, and that takes care of us in all the moments. Hebrews 5:14 says, "But solid food is for the mature, for those who have their powers of discernment trained by constant practice to distinguish good from evil." So if we keep God's word in our hearts, if we know what good and evil is, we know what God says about it, then when those situations come up, whether they're fair or not, whether they're expected or not, we know how to act. We know how to live as God would want us to live, how to honor God first and foremost, then how to honor others in those situations and bring them to honor God too, and not to go against what God would have them do. In the end, God took care of her, and He was taking care of her all along. From the very beginning, giving her discernment, and throughout the whole situation, He was with her. She realized that, she had a relationship with Him, and she was able to recognize things when things came. And that's what we want, to be discerning, and in turn, that makes us beautiful. I enjoyed studying with you, friend. I pray that the study of God's Word waters and nurtures your heart as you keep your relationship with God evergreen. Until next time, stay strong in the one who loves you more than anyone else ever could. I'll see you soon.